June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Unteroffizier Hermann Buscher gripped the rail as he came down the gangplank, legs unsteady after 14 days on the Atlantic. Through the haze, he saw a scene that contradicted 3 years of Nazi broadcasts. American dock workers, white and black, labored side by side with machines that looked as if they belonged to a future century. Women in coveralls ran cranes. Children sold newspapers at the gates. No one scattered at the sight of enemy uniforms. "The Americans are crazy," he muttered to the man behind him. Buscher later recorded the moment in his memoir, Behind Barbed Wire, published in Germany in 1952, one of the most detailed accounts of prisoner life in America. The Norfolk complex sprawled over 4,300 acres, its docks stretching beyond sight, cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships at once. In a single morning, the port handled more tonnage than Hamburg, processed in a week. Yet scale alone was not what stunned the prisoners, it was the normalcy. Civilians wandered near military installations. Vendors sold coffee and donuts within sight of warships. A brass band played popular tunes at a war bond rally. 2,500 veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps stood in formation on American soil, the first large group in what would become 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States by war's end. What they would see in the coming months was not only abundance. They would encounter something more unsettling to a military mind, a nation at war that refused to behave like it, a society so secure in its power that it treated mortal enemies like errant house guests, and a people whose odd customs would wear down Nazi ideology more effectively than any battlefield defeat. Processing at Norfolk began with what Buscher called the first impossibility. German doctrine from Poland to France to Africa held that prisoners were assets to exploit or burdens to minimize. The Geneva Convention was acknowledged when useful and ignored when not. Here American officers read the convention in fluent German, explained rights, and asked about dietary needs. International Red Cross records from June 1943 note that Jewish American personnel, including several sergeants with clearly Jewish surnames, handed out Red Cross packages while explaining that kosher meals were available for any Jewish prisoners. Some Wehrmacht soldiers laughed nervously, assuming mockery. It was not. The U.S. Army had planned for religious dietary requirements of enemies. Medical inspections overturned expectations. Wounded prisoners received the same penicillin that German field hospitals could scarcely obtain the same care given to American soldiers. Swiss Red Cross Inspector Guy Metreau wrote in July 1943 that medical treatment provided to German prisoners equaled or exceeded that given to American personnel. Prisoners admitted disbelief at the quality of care. African American medical staff served in integrated teams at Norfolk, though not across the entire service. In one documented case, a black medical technician drew blood from Wehrmacht officers for routine screening. In Germany, such contact was illegal. Here it was routine. Their first meal produced the most incomprehensible sight. The Germans were led into a mess hall where American sailors were eating. Enemies who had hunted one another in convoy battles used the same building. Americans at one end, Germans at the other, drawing from the same food lines and receiving the same quality meals. The sailors barely looked up, more interested in a baseball game on the radio than in enemies sitting 50 feet away. The 3-day train journey inland delivered the next shock. Unlike secretive movements in Germany, American authorities made no attempt to hide the prisoners. The trains were not boxcars, but passenger coaches with cushioned seats. They stopped at regular stations where civilians gathered to look on. At Union Station in Washington, D.C., as documented in June 1943 logs, German prisoners watched families seeing off soldiers headed to training camps. Wives kissed husbands in public. Children waved flags. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station restaurant. The same platform hosted enemies and families, separated only by windows and guards who seemed more focused on directing traffic than on the prisoners. The route passed industrial districts that by German standards should have been camouflaged. Instead, factories displayed their names in giant letters. The Glen L. Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore had parking lots visible from the tracks, filled with workers' cars. Prisoners could count B-26 bombers lined up for delivery. There was no attempt at concealment and no security panic, only industry operating in plain view of enemies. Through Pennsylvania, the trains passed coal mines and steel mills running continuous shifts. The night sky glowed orange from blast furnaces that never stopped. Workers' housing consisted of individual houses with gardens, not barracks, spread for miles around each plant. Electric lights burned in every window. Radio antennas rose from every roof. At a stop in Harrisburg, noted in railroad records, German officers watched workers at shift change. Men carried lunchboxes, wore leather shoes and wristwatches, and drove personal vehicles. According to Busher, one laborer threw away a half-eaten apple and opened a fresh one. The casual waste of food by a laborer stunned officers whose men had fought over scraps in Africa. Camp Hearne, Texas, opened in December 1942 on 720 acres near the town of Hearne in Robertson County. Records show it housed up to 4,800 prisoners in conditions superior to what many had known as civilians. Army Corps of Engineers files and War Department documents describe the infrastructure. Wooden barracks had electric lights. Indoor plumbing brought flush toilets and hot water to each building. Individual beds had mattresses, sheets, and blankets. Recreation halls held ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and libraries. Swiss Inspector Emil Sandstrom wrote in August 1943 that conditions at Camp Hearne exceeded not only Geneva Convention requirements but also the living standards many of the men knew in Germany. The commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, addressed arrivals in German, which he had studied at university. He set out rules and then added something unheard of. Prisoners would largely govern themselves within the compounds. They would elect spokesmen, organize activities, and manage schedules within military limits. Self-government for enemies looked like weakness or a trap to men raised under authoritarian command. The hospital, inspected monthly by the Red Cross, contained equipment missing from many German civilian facilities. X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental chairs, stocked pharmacies, and ample penicillin were on hand. When Georg Gartner, who would become famous as the last prisoner to surrender in 1985, developed appendicitis in September 1943, he underwent surgery within hours, performed by Captain William Calhoun of Dallas, with German prisoner medics assisting. Nothing prepared them for the camp canteen, a store where prisoners could buy goods with scrip earned from voluntary labor. Cigarettes, chocolate, soap, stationery, musical instruments, and art supplies filled the shelves. Quartermaster records show the War Department approved such sales in the belief that small comforts would sustain morale and reduce escape attempts. The idea that enemy prisoners could shop and choose purchases contradicted every instinct born of war. By September 1943, severe labor shortages led to prisoner employment across Texas. The War Manpower Commission, working with the Provost Marshal General, authorized agricultural and non-military jobs. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, the same base pay as American privates. Detailed files on these programs survive in National Archives Record Group 389. At the King Ranch near Kingsville, the scale of American agriculture defied European comparison. The ranch covered 825,000 acres, larger than Rhode Island. Ranch records from 1943 to 1945 show German prisoners working alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and some black ranch hands in cattle operations. The racial mix at work, though limited socially, contradicted Nazi hierarchies. Letters cleared by censors describe astonishment at mechanization. A single combine harvester replaced dozens of workers. Trucks moved crops where horse-drawn wagons would have been used in Europe. The ranch even used small civilian aircraft to survey herds and spot strays. Foreman Richard Kleberg, Jr. treated the prisoners as temporary employees rather than enemies, according to employment records. At cotton gins across Texas, including operations in Taylor, Caldwell, and Waller counties, prisoners saw processing speeds unimaginable in Europe. The Hearne Cotton Oil Mill, which used prisoner labor from August 1943 to December 1945, processed more cotton in a day than some German mills managed in a month. Workers took regular breaks, ate full lunches, and listened to radios while on the job. Productivity driven by decent treatment rather than harsh discipline ran against Wehrmacht. Experience. Prisoners learned that American farmers debated politics openly. FBI monitoring reports, declassified in the 1970s, noted the shock of prisoners hearing farmers attack Roosevelt and complain about policy without fear. At a farm near Bryan, a grower told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over allocation rules. He suffered no penalty. In Nazi Germany, such defiance could mean death. Local newspapers chronicled contact between prisoners and civilians. The Hearne Democrat, Bryan Daily Eagle, and Temple Daily Telegram ran stories on work details and community encounters, providing contemporary verification of events that amazed military men. In December 1943, the Hearne Democrat reported supervised Christmas shopping outings for prisoners who watched American teenage life at close range. Young people gathered at drugstore soda fountains, boys and girls together without chaperones, dancing to jukebox music that Nazi ideology called degenerate. They dressed fashionably despite wartime limits and showed no militarization of youth culture. American women's roles were equally startling. Women drove trucks for the Hearne Cotton Oil Mill, managed businesses on Main Street, and supervised male workers in defense plants. At nearby Bryan Army Airfield, part of the Women Air Force Service pilots program, female pilots ferried military aircraft. Military records confirm WASP operations at Bryan from 1943 to 1944, visible to prisoner work details in the area. Churches across Robertson County invited German prisoners to services. Records from First Baptist Church of Hearne, First Methodist, and St. Mary's Catholic document prisoner attendance. On December 24, 1943, the Hearne Democrat noted that prisoners attended Christmas Eve services among congregations whose sons served overseas, with no incidents reported. By early 1944, the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General had established extensive educational programs at Camp Hearne. Declassified records reveal a re-education effort that prisoners knew simply as voluntary schooling. The library, initially stocked with 500 books donated by townspeople, grew to more than 5,000 volumes by August 1944 through the American Library Association's Books for Prisoners program. Works by banned German authors appeared on the shelves, including Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque, and books by Jewish writers such as Lion Feuchtwanger. Sam Houston State Teachers College provided correspondence courses. College records show 340 prisoners enrolled in English, American history, mathematics, and agricultural science between 1944 and 1945. Professors visited monthly to give lectures and examinations. The camp newspaper requires clarification. While Der Ruf was published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, Camp Hearne prisoners produced their own paper titled Der Spiegel, The Mirror, unrelated to the later German news magazine. Copies preserved at the Army Heritage and Education Center show a shift from propaganda in early 1943 editions to democratic discussion by late 1944. Declassified special projects documents outline a careful psychological approach. The program grouped prisoners as anti-Nazis at roughly 10%, non-political men at 75%, and ardent Nazis at 15%. Each group received treatment designed to maximize ideological change. Anti-Nazis, identified through analysis of letters, conversations, and reading choices, received extra privileges and schooling, and became barracks leaders, discussion moderators, and newspaper editors. Their influence on the non-political majority was cultivated and watched closely. The screening process devised by Army psychologists and German émigré advisors used subtle tests. Reactions to news of German defeats were noted. Book selections from the library were logged. Participation in classes and patterns of social contact were tracked. Weekly summaries measured ideological drift across the population. Major Maxwell McKnight, the assistant executive officer whose papers are preserved at the Hoover Institution, wrote in November 1944 that the transformation rate exceeded expectations. He estimated that roughly 60% of non-political prisoners showed measurable movement toward democratic ideas after 6 months of exposure to American life and targeted education. Work details exposed the men to a level of material comfort that mocked their memories of scarcity. At the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, where prisoners handled materials from September 1943, more scrap was discarded in a day than German aircraft factories could gather in a week. Plant ledgers show that prisoners were assigned to scrap collection, giving them a front row view of industrial waste, on a scale that read as opulence. Food processing lines struck the hardest blow. At the Stokely Brothers cannery in Hearne, Texas, confirmed by Milam County records as using prisoner labor from Hearne, perfectly edible produce was rejected for minor flaws. Tomatoes a shade underripe, corn with uneven kernels, beans with small blemishes, all tossed while civilians in Germany queued for ration coupons. A letter from Corporal Friedrich Müller, preserved in Red Cross files, records his shock. He wrote that hundreds of pounds of fruit were destroyed because they did not meet canning standards. He noted that the American supervisor apologized for the waste, unaware that he was excusing an abundance the prisoners could not imagine. Christmas 1943 at Camp Hearne is unusually well documented in newspapers, Red Cross reports, and military files. The town of Hearne, population 2,000, organized to provide a proper holiday for enemy soldiers. The Hearne Democrat printed a long donor list on December 23rd. Churches collected thousands of individual gift packets. Schools sent handmade cards and decorations. American Legion Post 164, veterans who had fought Germans in the previous war, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports gear. The Lions Club supplied musical instruments. The Garden Club dressed the compound with holly and evergreen. The tree in the main yard stood 30 feet high and burned electric lights night and day. Quartermaster figures show that the camp used more electricity for decorations than many German villages consumed for all purposes. Such display would have been unthinkable even in peacetime Germany. Local choirs performed in German. The First Methodist Church learned carols phonetically under director Sarah Patterson, whose son was serving in Italy. The sight of American mothers singing to enemy soldiers left several prisoners in tears. Guard notes confirm emotional breakdowns during and after services. The feast menu in Quartermaster records lists roast turkey at £1 per man, ham, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, mince pie, apple pie, ice cream, beer for enlisted men, and California wine for officers. The total intake approached 5,000 calories per person at a time when German civilian rations, when available at all, hovered near 1,200. Work in Texas brought the prisoners face to face with American racial realities that both challenged Nazi propaganda and revealed American contradictions. At Camp Hearne, black soldiers from the 359th Infantry Regiment occasionally served as guards. Men raised on racial law found themselves obeying orders from black Americans. Some requested transfers rather than submit. The requests were denied. Lieutenant Colonel Stiles wrote in December 1943 that objections to black guards were recorded and ignored. Yet, segregation also cut the other way. Prisoners could sit in restaurants in Hearne that refused to seat the black soldiers guarding them. They could attend movies where their guards were barred from the main section. Enemies enjoyed more social access than some citizens. That paradox shook certainties. On farms, the mix of Mexican-American, black, and German laborers focused on output rather than bloodlines. Efficiency and mixed crews undermined theories of racial purity and productivity. Cotton fields provided humbling proof. German prisoners picked beside black workers who often outpaced them by wide margins. Superiority myths withered under the weight of daily tallies. 3 cases show the arc of change. Hermann Buscher arrived convinced of Nazi doctrine. His memoir records a long erosion of belief under countless small frictions. The break came at Christmas 1943, when townspeople gave presents to enemies. He wrote that the gifts showed strength, not softness, and the confidence of a victor who had already won the future peace. Buscher immigrated in 1953, took citizenship in 1958, and worked as an engineer at General Motors until retirement. Georg Gartner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, in September 1945 and lived under the name Dennis Wiles for 4 decades. He did not flee the country. He married, raised children, and taught tennis in California. When he finally surrendered in 1985 for a television program, he had been American longer than he had been German. His autobiography, Hitler's Last Soldier in America, became a touchstone for the power of exposure to a different society. Reinhold Pohl fled Camp Washington, Illinois, in 1945 from boredom and curiosity rather than abuse. His memoir, Enemies Are Human, recounts 7 illegal years in Chicago, working in bookstores and marrying an American, before he voluntarily turned himself in 1953. The FBI found no crimes beyond illegal entry. He received citizenship in 1959 and became a successful businessman who later sponsored other immigrants. Across more than 500 camps, patterns repeated with local flavor. Camp Alva, Oklahoma, specialized in agricultural training. Department of Agriculture files show a 200-acre demonstration farm managed by prisoners using American methods. They learned mechanical cultivation, rotational planting, soil conservation, and hybrid seed practice. These skills paid off when men returned to ruined fields in Germany. Demand for trained crews grew so strong that local farmers paid premiums, competing for prisoner labor. Camp Concordia, Kansas became famous for art. Prisoners painted murals that still hang in county buildings. An orchestra outfitted with instruments donated by Kansans played for civilian audiences. The local paper reviewed performances as professional in quality. Much of the artwork now sits in museum collections. Camp Trinidad, Colorado, dealt with brutal winters. Quartermaster records show Arctic-grade clothing, insulated barracks, and increased rations to 4,000 calories in cold months. Swiss Inspector André Poncet reported in February 1944 that prisoners at Trinidad admitted receiving better winter provisions than Wehrmacht troops on the Eastern Front. Perhaps nothing struck German military minds more than American openness. Camps received newspapers that criticized the war effort, exposed production problems, and dissected strategic errors. The Special Projects Division distributed multiple viewpoints, betting that a free press would break totalitarian habits. Radios in recreation halls carried comedians who mocked generals and politicians. Broadcast journalists questioned plans on the air. Congress debated appropriations in public with dissenting votes. Enemies could listen to all of it. The 1944 presidential campaign looked like madness to men who equated unity with silence. Roosevelt faced a serious challenge from Thomas Dewey in wartime. Republicans attacked management of the conflict. Newspapers printed opposition arguments. Cartoonists lampooned the commander-in-chief. Yet production rose, and operations continued. Democracy gained strength through discord. That lesson struck deeper than any lecture. International Red Cross inspections, preserved in Geneva, consistently rated American camps above treaty standards. Guy Metro's August 1944 report says American facilities exceeded requirements across categories. Food matched or surpassed Army rations. Medical care equaled that of military hospitals. Educational and recreational opportunities exceeded many training camps. Specific figures at Camp Hearne list daily calories between 3,300 and 3,800 against a treaty floor of 2,000. Living space at 40 square feet per man against a requirement of 27. A medical ratio of 1 doctor per 500 prisoners against a standard of 1 per 1,000. Organized sports, libraries, and classes far beyond the vague call for adequate recreation. Inspector Emil Sandstrom compared the United States favorably to Canada, Britain, and Australia, concluding that American camps were superior not only in material terms, but in a guiding philosophy. He wrote that Americans appeared to treat prisoners as temporarily displaced persons rather than permanent enemies. Industrial assignments displayed production methods that rewired German assumptions. At the Lone Star Steel plant in Dangerfield, Texas, where Hearne men worked in 1944 and 1945, monthly output rivaled the Ruhr's annual pre-bombing totals. The secret was not only machinery. Company records show incentive pay, suggestion programs, and visible pride. Walls posted shift output like ball scores. Workers wore company pins and bought war bonds with overtime. Foremen painted bomber names on steel slated for military contracts. Morale multiplied productivity faster than supervision. Railroad logistics delivered a similar shock. At the Missouri-Kansas-Texas yard in Smithville, where prisoners loaded freight, trains arrived on tight schedules. Derricks and forklifts cycled without idle time. Telegraph and telephone networks synchronized traffic across states. No central planning board commanded the flow. Market signals and layered operations created order at scale. As the Reich collapsed in spring 1945, American planners prepared prisoners for return to a shattered homeland. The effort went beyond transport. Project Paperclip drew scientists, but broader programs trained thousands for reconstruction. Civil administration courses taught city management. Agricultural instruction focused on feeding a starving population. Medical staff studied public health for epidemic control. Engineers learned bridge repair and utilities restoration. The Special Projects Division identified potential civic leaders and added modules on governance and law. Provost Marshall reports list enrollments by May 1945 at 31,000 in vocational training, 18,000 in English, 12,000 in agriculture, 8,500 in technical fields, and 6,200 in business administration. Marshall Plan concepts were explained in camp lectures before public rollout. State Department officials visited to describe a policy aimed at rebuilding rather than punishing. Such generosity from victors attacked the core of Nazi belief in permanent struggle. The statistics outline the scope. Of 425,000 prisoners held in the United States, there were 2,222 escape attempts, or roughly half of 1%. Only 54 remained at large more than 30 days, about 1/100th of 1%. Sabotage totaled 7 confirmed cases. Work refusals numbered 178 incidents. Voluntary labor participation reached 87% of eligible men. Postwar surveys by occupation authorities recorded that 74% of returnees held favorable views of American democracy. 61% supported Marshall Plan aid. 55% favored alliance. 38% wished to emigrate. 23% maintained contact with American families. Immigration files show 5,000 former prisoners legally entered the United States in the 1950s. Naturalization records indicate 92% became citizens when eligible. Indicators of employment, home ownership, and low criminality exceeded general immigrant averages. Returned prisoners influenced the rebuilding of the Federal Republic. Archives record 48 former prisoners in the Bundestag. 312 served as mayors or council members. 1,847 worked in agricultural modernization. 2,341 taught in reopened schools. 4,165 managed firms using methods learned in America. Industrialist Hans-Georg von Studnitz told interviewers in 1965 that they brought back practical knowledge of democratic function, free markets, and cooperation across differences. He said they had seen a working future. Camp Hearne closed in December 1945, but ties endured. The Hearne Heritage League kept letters for decades. Christmas cards arrived until the last known prisoner died in 2001. The correspondence shows lasting change rather than a camp-bound influence. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 50 former Hearne prisoners returned for a reunion, covered at length by the Hearne Democrat. Former enemies embraced former guards. Veterans placed flowers at the American Legion Memorial. Spokesman Fritz Zimmermann said they had come as believers in racial destiny and left as friends who understood that democratic disorder is a source of strength and that diversity creates unity. Historians have mapped the experience in detail. Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America offers a comprehensive survey. Judith Gansberg's Stalag USA analyzes the reeducation system. Antonio Thompson's Men in German Uniform studies labor programs. Ron Robbins' The Barbed Wire College explores educational change. Based on archives, interviews, and government files, these works agree that American treatment of German prisoners stands as the most successful case of transformation through exposure rather than indoctrination. The German prisoners who reached America between 1943 and 1946 witnessed scenes that seemed impossible through the lens of their upbringing. Every ordinary freedom, every small kindness, Every instance of casual generosity chipped away at the worldview built by years of indoctrination. They had expected to find a divided, decadent people, a nation surviving only through industrial might, not moral strength. Instead, they found a society so confident in itself that it could afford to treat its enemies with decency, even friendship. The transformation they underwent did not come through formal propaganda, but through the quiet, relentless power of example. German soldiers saw democracy functioning not in abstract ideals, but in daily life. They watched Americans argue about politics without fear, criticize their leaders, and still unite when it mattered. They saw workers taking pride in their labor without coercion. They met guards and officers who followed rules because they believed in them, not because they feared punishment. They observed racial integration advancing unevenly but visibly. They saw women leading, flying, managing, and contributing as equals. To eyes trained in tyranny, these simple things were revelations. The prisoners realized that American chaos was not weakness, but vitality. What appeared at first to be disorder was in truth freedom, a system strong enough to absorb dissent and still move forward. In this strange land, even humor had political power. Comedians mocked generals, citizens challenged authority, and yet no one disappeared for it. For men raised on the Gestapo's silence, laughter itself became subversion. Many came to understand that America's strength was not its weapons or factories, but its people's faith in the right to question. These revelations rewired loyalties more completely than any interrogation could. When the war ended, thousands of repatriated prisoners carried home new ideas. They spoke of guards who treated them as equals, of teachers who debated philosophy with them, of small-town Americans who sent Christmas gifts to their former enemies. They contrasted this with the ruins of Germany and the fanaticism that had brought it down. Out of their testimonies grew a generation of Germans who rejected totalitarianism, not from defeat, but from conviction. The data proves the transformation. Of the 425,000 prisoners held in America, the escape rate was negligible, violence almost non-existent, morale high. 87% volunteered for labor programs that rebuilt parts of the U.S. wartime economy. After repatriation, post-war surveys by Allied occupation authorities found that 3 out of 4 returned prisoners described America favorably. Over 60% supported cooperation between Germany and the United States, and more than a third openly wished to immigrate. Thousands did, becoming citizens, engineers, businessmen, and professors who embodied the democratic values they had once been taught to despise. Their influence reached far beyond personal success. Former prisoners helped shape post-war West Germany's civic institutions. They carried American lessons into schools, farms, and town councils. 48 became Bundestag deputies, hundreds served as mayors, thousands led local industries and educational reforms. They implemented agricultural practices learned on Texan farms, management systems modeled on American factories, and community programs inspired by local churches and civic clubs. The democratic character of post-war West Germany owed much to these men who had once come as enemies and left as believers in freedom. Hans-Georg von Studnitz, once a Wehrmacht officer and later a leading industrialist, summarized it best in an interview in 1965. "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets work, how people of different backgrounds cooperate. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked." His words captured the essence of what occurred inside those barbed wire compounds, a quiet revolution of the mind. When Camp Hearne finally closed in December 1945, its barracks were dismantled, but the relationships built there endured. The Hearne Heritage League preserved thousands of letters between former prisoners and townspeople. Christmas cards continued arriving for decades, reminders of bonds formed in the unlikeliest of places. In 1984, for the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 50 former prisoners returned to Hearne. Local newspapers documented the reunion, former guards shaking hands with former captives, German veterans laying wreaths at American memorials, and townspeople welcoming them as old friends. Fritz Zimmermann, speaking for the group, said, "We came as enemies believing in racial superiority and destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, and that diversity creates unity. Historians have since studied this transformation in depth. Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America, 1979, remains a foundational account. Judith Gansberg's Stalag USA, 1977, explores the education and propaganda programs. Antonio Thompson's Men in German Uniform, 2010, investigates prisoner labor systems, while Ron Robbins' The Barbed Wire College, 1995, examines the psychological reorientation through exposure to freedom. Across these studies, the conclusion remains consistent. America's treatment of German prisoners represents history's most successful re-education effort achieved not through indoctrination, but through lived demonstration. The German prisoners did not simply witness American power, they experienced American values firsthand. They saw the contradictions, the imperfections, the prejudices, but they also saw self-correction, progress, and openness. They experienced a society that punished cruelty, but rewarded effort, that valued humor over hate, and that built loyalty through respect rather than fear. What changed them was not mercy, but normalcy, the everyday reality of a free people. In the end, the unusual sights that astonished the prisoners, the mixed-race work crews, women pilots, free newspapers, open debates, public laughter were not exceptional to Americans at all. They were ordinary. Yet to men raised under total control, they were revolutionary. Those ordinary moments did what military might never could. They humanized the enemy, broke the spell of ideology, and replaced obedience with understanding. America's greatest victory of the Second World War was not only on the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific. It was in its prison camps places where enemies became advocates through exposure to freedom's quiet logic. The prisoners who once saluted the swastika left those camps believing in something far stronger. The idea that liberty, though chaotic, produces not weakness but enduring strength. They arrived expecting to find hatred and superiority confirmed. Instead, they found mirrors of what they could become. Those unusual sights, the women driving trucks, the black medics tending wounds, the factory workers laughing at their foremen, the people singing for peace while waging war, became the foundation for a transformation that reshaped nations. Out of that transformation came the seeds of the Marshall Plan, the Atlantic Alliance, and a democratic Europe rebuilt on lessons learned not from lectures, but from life. The German prisoners had come to America as captives. They left as witnesses to the simple, disarming power of humanity itself.